We are looking at the last few verses in chapter 9, and we're going to look at all of chapter 10. What we're going to see in these verses as you're turning there, especially when we get to chapter 10, is a long list of examples that prove this very simple yet often questionable point that wisdom is better. That is the point I want to make today. No matter what culture says, no matter what our impulses may be, no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in, no matter what the outcome of a decision may be in the moment, wisdom is always better. That's what the preacher is going to say. Wisdom is better than having a lot of money. Wisdom is better than power and strength. Wisdom is better than natural skill or acquired talent. Wisdom is better than positive recognition. When it comes to life under the sun, wisdom is the thing that we should be looking after because wisdom is better. Again, that's the point the author is going to make, and again, he's going to prove that with a very long list of examples, which is where I get my title this morning, Can You Give Me an Example? That's my title. Perhaps some of you know this already, but in case you haven't, let me bring you into the know on something. The people that I get to work with every single day, they do not hesitate to make fun of me. Just this morning, I had already written that down, and Nathan sent a text message to me, Rob, and Cody of photos of us saying, this is your new contact photo. And it was very awkward photos of all three of us. They do not hesitate to make fun of me especially. And I consider myself to be decently high on the level of self-awareness. And yet I learned things about myself that I didn't know previously by the way my staff makes fun of me. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, Savannah, who sings up here on Sunday mornings, she was serving as a summer intern. And, so, low on the totem pole, as they say. And yet, near the end of her time, she felt comfortable enough to throw a joke at my expense. And she pointed out to me something that I did not previously know about myself, that every time I tell a story, if I'm sitting down, I have to stand up and tell the story. And she pointed it out to me. And again, I didn't know this about myself previously, so now every time I tell a story, and when I go to stand up, I'm standing there, and little Savannah pops up on my shoulder right here, and she says, "See, Aaron, I told you." She is living rent-free in my head every time I tell a story. Most recently, Ashley made fun of me because of the way I laugh. Evidently, there's this viral meme or GIF going around, or GIF, whatever you call it, making fun of the way rich people laugh. And she said it sounded like me, the way I laughed. And Cody agreed. I didn't hear it, but you know what? She did it anyway. She made fun of me. Melody got me good, though, last year at our staff Christmas party. She made a list of Aaron-isms, which I didn't appreciate. But one of them was, can you give me an example? Evidently, I say this all the time. Josh Hunsaker pointed out that I say that's funny a lot on the podcast. So now I can't say that's funny anymore because Josh Hunsaker pops up over here. But evidently, Melody pointed out that in staff meetings, if someone is saying something or talking about, they're making a point, I will then usually respond by saying, can you give me an example of that? Evidently, I say it so much that it stuck out to Melody and put it as one of her Aaron-isms. But I bring this up because, like me, evidently, the preacher in Ecclesiastes loves examples. And he's going to give a bunch of examples that prove in various ways this main point, that wisdom is better. What we're going to see in these examples is the evidence of his point and the difficulty of his point, because the better part of wisdom is not always seen in the moment or even in the end. And yet the preacher still believes that wisdom is better. We're going to read the whole section together. Chapter 9, verse 13, and then all the way to the end of chapter 10. If you don't have a Bible with you, there's one under one of the chairs around you. But he says this, I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be. And who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. That opening section, the end of chapter 9, is where I'm getting both the title and the point that wisdom is better. He says it there in verse 13, I've seen this example of wisdom under the sun. And it's a great example. He says it seemed great to me. And then he gives this primary example of this poor old man who delivers the city through his wisdom from a powerful military force that came to attack it. At the end of that story is where we get the point of the story. He says in verse 16, I say this, wisdom is better than might. Verse 17, he writes, the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. And in verse 18, wisdom is better than weapons of war. The point is clear. The point of the story. The preacher wants us to understand that when it comes to life under the sun, wisdom is always better. But let's look a little closer at this first example. Again, he tells the story of a small city, and there's a few men in it, which implies there weren't that many men to call up to go and fight on behalf of the city against this great army that was there to attack them. So it was vulnerable, this city. Its defenses were small. He describes this great king with a lot of resources that came up against it. The overall picture is that this was doomed to be destroyed. However, though this small city did not have a lot of men to call up, it did not have the resources to defend itself, the city had something. It had something better than all of that. It had a poor wise man. And the preacher tells us that by his wisdom, he delivered the city, which is incredible. And there's some debate around this story. Is it a true story? Is it just a made-up parable or allegory or something like that? And I believe that the preacher, the one telling the story, wants us to believe this is an actual real event. He observed this happening. Maybe he saw it multiple times. He also doesn't tell us what piece of advice this wise man said to deliver the city. And I don't think that's really the point. The point is not that it was strategy or skill that won the day. It was the man's wisdom that delivered the city. But there's a tragedy in the story. Did you see that? Though the poor man, through his wisdom, delivered the city, and saved countless lives as a result. You would think that he would be paraded down the middle of the city for saving their lives, and yet what does he say? Yet no one remembered that guy. No one remembered this poor man. He went right back to his lowly, obscure place in the world, which leaves us, the hearer of the story, to wonder, well, if wisdom is that much better, if no one remembers you, then how can wisdom be better? And yet the point is still made from the example, that wisdom is better than might, and wise words are better than shouting. The difficulty in this point is that though wisdom has the capacity to save lives, wisdom is often not the thing that people remember. People remember strength, they remember greatness, and they remember big personalities, but very rarely, if ever, is wisdom desired or celebrated above all things, though it should be. That's what the preacher is saying here. I bet if you were able to go back and ask this poor, wise man if he would exchange his wisdom for recognition, exchange it for reputation, exchange it for riches, he would probably graciously say, no, thank you. I will go back to my place and I will hold on to my wisdom, because he's wise. And that's what wisdom does. A biblical example, I think, of a person who understood this value of wisdom was young Solomon. When he became king in place of his father David, and God came to him and told him that he would give him anything he desired, the thing he asked God for was wisdom to lead and rule his people well. And of course, God praised this request. And he said to him, because you did not ask for riches or strength or the heads of your enemies, I will grant this request. And he caused Solomon to become the wisest man in history, apart from Christ, of course. And he gave him riches and power and peace throughout his empire on top of all of that. But Solomon asked for wisdom. He asked for this important thing in that moment because he knew he could have all the strength, all the money, all the recognition in the world, but without wisdom, all of that stuff's doomed to fail. So from this first example, we learn the point, that wisdom is better. We'll come back to this story at the end because there's a really important thing that we can still learn from it. But for now, there are more examples. And he jumps into it in chapter 10 and gives just this long list of proverbial sayings. And there's really no easy way to go through it than just to walk through the Proverbs. So we're just going to do that. I'm not going to read them all again. I'll refer to them. In verse 1, if you just want to look down at it again, the preacher gives an example of how wisdom, though better than anything you can gain in this life, still has its limits. And it's easily lost through one act of stupidity and foolishness. You could be the wisest person, but the moment you do something stupid, that's what everyone will remember you by. You could be the wisest parent, the best pastor, the greatest business partner a person could ever want, but they will remember the one act of folly. And the wiser you get, the tighter that is, the more strict those rules apply to foolishness. And yet the preacher says wisdom is still better because in verse 2 he makes the point that the wise man goes the right way while the fool goes the wrong direction. So much of life is about choices and reacting to the choices that come to us. Very rarely do we find ourselves in the position where we control the process and the outcome of something. He's saying we react to life, and the wise person knows the right direction against the wrong. That's why he says wisdom is better, because wisdom knows the right way. The fool who thinks he's doing right typically chooses the wrong direction. And to the person who has wisdom, this foolishness is evident, or this wisdom is evident, while the foolish person, they're oblivious to it. In verse 3, he points out, this is interesting, that the fool reveals just how stupid he is just by the way he walks down the street. You can see it. Everybody can see it, even though he can't see it. Let me give you an example of this. I was having coffee recently or lunch, and they're a musician, and they were telling me about when they do auditions with other musicians that they can tell how proficient that musician is just by the way they walk on the stage and the way they handle their gear. You can tell just by the way they carry themselves, if they know what they're doing. I'm a golfer, so I can tell if someone's actually a good golfer just by the way they dress or what part of the driving range they go to first to warm up on. And I'll usually observe this, and then I make a choice. Am I playing 9 holes a day or 18? Because if I don't like what I see, then I'm just playing 9 that day. I'm just kidding. No, I'm not. I really do make the decision. But more, yeah, thank you, Nathan. It's 9 holes for you. Nathan's not even coming out. He knows. But more important than playing golf or playing an instrument, you can tell a fool from the wise just by the way that they live their lives, the choices that they make. And this is why he's saying, listen, wisdom is better. You don't want to go that direction. Verse 4, we get an example of how wisdom is better than vengeance and vindication. He commends the wise person. Listen, don't overreact when confronted by an authority figure. A few things come to mind when I think about this. First, fighting fire with fire only results in everyone getting burned, right? If you feel the heat coming at you, responding with more heat isn't going to help. Second, people in authority need grace too. Just because they're in an authority position doesn't mean that they always respond perfectly. That we expect them to. That's why we get frustrated. But they won't. They need grace too. Third, just because they are upset at you doesn't necessarily mean they're upset with you. So don't take it personal. They could be upset at something else and they're just like venting in your direction. That's no excuse for being treated badly. It's just people being people. Fourth, even if they are angry with you because you did something foolish, your reaction to the correction, and I think this is primarily what he's getting at, your reaction to the correction is more important than the offense that caused it, the thing that you did. Again, calmness can lay great offenses to rest. You're going to make mistakes, and someone will confront you. But that frustration they'll have will go away if you prove that you understand the mistake you made and are committed to growing. But if you just make more excuses for yourself, then that anger will burn even more. So again, wisdom is better than vengeance or vindication. Moving on to some more examples, verses 5 and 7. These are, in my opinion, kind of interesting. The preacher gives an example of this error in leadership he has seen. How leaders often put people in positions of authority who have no skill or character to lead well, while the people who should be leading are put in lower level positions. And anyone who has worked a job or played on a sports team will agree. The coach puts their kid in more often in the starting lineup when maybe they're not the best player on the team. The boss gives the promotion to the suck-up while the person who just comes to work and works hard every day and doesn't need that validation, they don't get the promotion. This kind of thing happens everywhere, and what he's saying is it's an error in leadership, it's an error in wisdom. But wisdom, for the person who doesn't get the promotion or the opportunity, it's better than gaining promotion or being the starter on the team. Wisdom is better because the wise know what really matters. As we move on, verse 8 to 11, the preacher appears to be making a concession, it seems, to his point. And he shows some examples of how sometimes unexpected things, they happen in life, no matter how wise you are. Verse 8 and 9, if you just want to look at them again, make the point that no matter what you do, you're just kind of doing life, there are unintended and uncontrollable factors. You could get hurt at work. You could get injured in a sport that you're really good at. In other words, there are risks in life that cannot be avoided, no matter how much wisdom you gain. It doesn't mean that wisdom isn't better, it just means things happen in life. The same is true in verse 11. He talks about this snake charmer and how a snake bites, and so it's no good for the charmer. This thing that you do every single day and you're really good at, you can't control what things happen. But in verse 10, he comes back to his point that wisdom is still better, even when things can't be controlled or predicted. And his point is kind of simply this. This is the main idea of work smarter, not harder. Wisdom will tell you, hey, you keep chopping that wood there and it's taking you 2 hours, you've gotten nothing done. Maybe you should just go sharpen the axe and you'll chop faster with less effort. It's a pretty simple idea. But have you ever noticed that the fool thinks they don't have time to stop working and get more training? They think that's a waste of time. But wisdom will tell you that skill is better than strength Sharpness is better than sweat equity. You can work as hard as you want, but if you work smarter, not harder, it'll actually get the job done better. So wisdom is better in that situation. But then, verse 12 to 15, the preacher gives some examples of how always having something to say doesn't mean you're wise either. And essentially, this example is showing how words reveal if someone is wise or if they're a fool. A person's words gain them favor, while the words of a fool cost them greatly. We've all had those experiences when someone is talking, and the longer they go on talking, the more you realize that they have no idea what they're talking about. And it reminds me of a well-known quote I heard a long time ago. I tried to find who the source of the quote was, but there's debate on it. So here's the quote: "Better to remain silent and to be thought a fool than to speak and to remove all doubt." And I think that's what the preacher is getting at here. Our words reveal that wisdom, if wisdom is there. And it makes the point that wisdom is better. It's better than always having something to say. And finally, in the last set of verses, this was kind of the more tricky one for me, but 16 to 20, I think the preacher is just giving a variety of examples to show how wisdom helps you keep things in their proper context and perspective. When things are in their right context and perspective, things go well. In verse 16 and 17, we see there's a land that's struggling because the leaders are acting like children. And yet how a land is successful when leaders do lead well, because they understand the weight of responsibility they carry. There's a context and a perspective that's working here. The same is true in verse 18. He gives an example of a leaky roof to show that laziness caused that. Somebody is not taking care of their responsibilities. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing in that moment. And there's wisdom that's lacking. Verse 19 simply makes the point further. There's things in life that are to be enjoyed in their right context. Bread is for laughter, wine for gladness, money satisfies everything. It makes everything work. I mean, he's not making a promise, he's just making a general statement about life. And finally, in verse 20, the wise person knows that the thoughts they think, even though they're in their own heads, will often show themselves somehow, some way, either in their actions or something like that. A person doesn't have to hear what you think about them or the decisions they make to know how you feel. Your actions will often prove them. Someone in life group this last week pointed out, when you think these thoughts, or you're in your own head or you're in your own home, the birds in the air are often just your children. Your children take the words that they hear you say, and then they run off and tell their teacher what you what you said. Someone in our men's ministry yesterday was telling me, I think it was a conversation he was having with a parent and a teacher, that the teacher said to the parent, "I won't believe what your kid says about you if you don't believe what your kid says about me." That's perfect. But in general, I think all a person needs to know or see is your actions toward them or your actions toward previous leaders, and that will often tell them all they need to know about what you really think. Now, I'm not sure why the preacher felt the need to create this long and certainly not exhaustive list of examples to show how wisdom is better than almost anything you could hope to gain or achieve in this life. Again, it's better than opportunities, it's better than skill or talent, it's better than money or power. But I think what is clear is that he wants his readers to know that when it comes to understanding life under the sun, wisdom is the most important thing that you are going to need, which brings me back to that first example. The example of the poor man who delivered the city, but was forgotten over time. Again, we don't know the advice that this poor man gave that led to the deliverance of the city, and we don't know the power and the strength of this army that he overcame, but what we know in this example is that wisdom proved to be greater than the greatest army that could come against a small little city. But as great as that example was, and it was a very great example, as Christians, we have an even greater example of the better part of wisdom in the person and work of Jesus. Paul said this in 1 Corinthians, that Jesus, when he came in his incarnation, became to us wisdom from God. When we think of wisdom, we just look to Christ. Because like the king in our story here in Ecclesiastes, Jesus has also delivered his people through wisdom. But it was not against some great king of the earth, but as Paul points out in Ephesians, it was against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Again, we don't know the wisdom that this poor old wise man shared that delivered the city, but we do know the wisdom that Jesus shared. It was a wisdom through his death and sacrifice on the cross. It was a wisdom revealed through him becoming poor. Paul writes this again in Philippians 2. Jesus, though he was in heaven with God forever, emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. By Jesus becoming poor, we become spiritually rich through faith in him. By his being made low, he delivered us from evil. Friends, that is the wisdom of the gospel. That is the wisdom that is counterintuitive to the wisdom of the world. In fact, the wisdom calls that wisdom, God's wisdom, the wisdom of the gospel, foolishness. Because the world believes that the best thing in life is more power, more strength, more recognition, more money, more resources, more popularity. But this wisdom proves something different. And it challenges us in our response to it. Maybe the reason why he's giving us all of these real life examples is to just drill home this point that wisdom is better, so that we will choose this kind of wisdom, God's wisdom, and not the world's wisdom. The tragedy in this story, again, is that the poor wise man was forgotten. Even though he saved all the citizens of his town, no one remembered him. They forgot that wisdom was better, which should remind us of that story told in Luke 17 of when Jesus heals the 10 lepers. They're walking away and he heals all of them, but only one of them comes back to thank him. And the point of the story is, if he heals you, what are you going to do? Are you going to forget him, or are you just going to walk away? Will you forget the wisdom of Christ and his deliverance of you, or will you be the preacher, like the preacher here in Ecclesiastes, who remembered the story of deliverance and this great wisdom and this example and recalls it as such? Will you be like that? Will you believe in the wisdom of Christ to deliver you? Will you keep believing it? Will you choose to walk in that wisdom even when wisdom seems illogical? And I think the thing that's going to help you respond correctly is to remember the point the preacher is making here, that wisdom is better, especially when that wisdom is from God. Will you be an example of someone who responded rightly to the call of wisdom, or will you be someone who shuts their ears to the voice and closes their eyes to see it, this work of wisdom? This is what we as believers are called to do. And this is what we, maybe if you don't yet believe in Jesus, are called to respond to. We have a way that we think is right in our own eyes. And yet here we are told something different, which is the way of wisdom, which is the way of the gospel, to believe and follow him, even when everything is telling us to go a different direction. Why don't we pray, and then we'll have a time of communion together. God, we are so thankful that you have revealed to us what is the true and the right way, and it's through Christ. We are thankful to be reminded of the fact that Jesus, in his coming, in his dying, in his rising again from the grave, proved that his wisdom is greater than any wisdom that is in the world. And by believing and surrendering to his wisdom, we get to walk in blessing and newness of life. Help us to do that, God. We don't always make the right choices, but by looking to Christ, we can know that we are walking in the truth and in the light. I pray you would help us to do that. I pray that you would help some to do it maybe for the first time, who have never put their faith and trust in you, that they would do it today, confessing that they have been walking in the way of folly and instead now want to choose the way of wisdom. God, I pray that you would help us to guide one another in this path of wisdom. And we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.